Hi, my name is Alison Reiheld. I'll be giving a guest lecture today. And I've been asked to do this guest lecture because one of my research areas is fatness. I am currently the director of women's studies, so that will soon be Carolina Rocha. And I'm also a professor of philosophy. As you may be able to tell, I am myself fat. Now, I could talk about fatness and various aspects of fatness for hours and hours, but I'm not going to do that to you. I'm going to pick a pretty narrow way of thinking and talking about fatness. I do want to just let you know that some of the things that I won't talk about include the ways that fat people find they can't get access to medical care because their doctors are so focused on treating their fatness that they don't get around to their other problems like rheumatoid arthritis, trouble breathing that doctors chalk up to fatness but might actually be lung cancer or untreated asthma, things like that. So that's a big issue that I work on. And if you were to Google my name, you might find that I've done some talks on that, for instance. I also work on public health campaigns with obesity and the kinds of messaging that are used. And some of that will come up today, but a lot of it won't. So one thing I would like you to think about for just a second is, how did you react when I said that I identified as a fat person? I'm going to give you just a second to think about that. So my guess is that you didn't have particularly strong feelings about the way I look until I mentioned that. You might have noticed that I was not skinny. You might have noticed that I'm short, if this is as typically heighted bookshelf, which I am. And you might have thought when I said I was fat that I'm insulting myself. So now spend about 10 seconds thinking, why does it seem like the word fat is an insult instead of a description? So one of the things that fat activists do is they try to reclaim the notion of fatness so that it becomes just a descriptor for a particular kind of body size and a set of body shapes, which are not the kind of rail thin bodies that we often see in modeling, or the skinny but voluptuous bodies that we often see in modeling that are designed, and I mean literally designed because they're often photoshopped, designed to be appealing and to set up unrealistic goals that the vast majority of people can't meet. So there are a number of studies that have found that only about 5% of humans have naturally got a body type that even remotely resembles what you see in the magazines. Everyone else has to work for it. They have to work their asses off for it, like literally, right? So what I'm going to talk about today with this camera is bodies. And the reason that I have this camera on rather than doing a PowerPoint lecture is because I think it's important for you to see my body as I'm talking about bodies like mine. Right? It's important for you to see my face, to see my expressions, and so forth. So I want to record this body talking about bodies. Now, this body has been called many things. Many of them have been shouted out of a car window, not by all men, but exclusively by men. And sometimes those things were about how sexy this body was, how much it appealed to them, how much they would like to do certain sexual things to it. Other times, they've been comments that have attempted to shame me into going back into my house. On one occasion, I was exercising with my family, and I had gotten separated from them at a stoplight, so they were a little bit ahead of me. And somebody leaned out their window here in Edwardsville and shouted at me, essentially, in very crude language, to get back in the house because they found my body disgusting, and that people like me shouldn't be exercising in public where other people had to watch me jiggle. Right? But if we tend to have stereotypes of fat people as lazy, why would someone want to make someone who was not being lazy and who was fat stop being active? I think that's because the notion of disgust around fat bodies is so intense that we end up having in our society a bunch of really intensely conflicting ideas. All right. Now, this body has been seen eating and told to stick to salad, has ordered dessert and had people raise their eyes and say, "Are you sure?" Right? This body has felt compelled at parties for someone's birthday to say, "I didn't have breakfast this morning and I ran 2 miles, so I'm going to have a piece of cake." Right? Why would I feel compelled to say that? Because I know that I'm being judged. I know that I'm being constantly surveilled for how I eat. One of the things we're going to talk about today is how it's not only fat bodies to whom this happens. It's primarily women, but also men. And it is, in fact, all bodies. I'm going to give you a few ideas to work from, some of which are in the reading that I suggested to your professors for this class, some of which are not. Right? So first, I'm going to give you something to think about from a recent article by Rebecca Kukla. So recent that it came out since I was asked to help out with this guest lecture. Right? In a 2018 book chapter released in 2019 in the Routledge Encyclopedia of Food Ethics, Rebecca Kukla says, in her book chapter called Shame, Seduction, and Character in Food Messaging, she says, "We actually receive a tension-ridden and conflicting set of messages whose upshot is that any eating practices in which we might engage are at risk of being shamed. There's no normatively safe way to eat in our culture," she says, "no set of eating practices that makes one more or less immune from shaming and criticism. Moreover," she claims, "our eating practices are routinely portrayed as having character significance. So how we eat is taken to reflect on who we are and what kind of person we are." She says, "There is no right kind of person to be in our culture when it comes to food. Food messaging follows a contradictory logic," she says, "in which images of sin, disgust, temptation, risk, safety, perversion, pleasure, and recklessness are mixed together in a fundamentally incoherent way. Our eating norms are socially and materially scaffolded in important ways." She says, "We cannot just use willpower to ignore or overcome these kinds of pressures. We must acknowledge the force of these damaging and contradictory norms." Right? So Rebecca Kukla of Georgetown University, who's also the editor of the Kennedy Institute of Ethics Journal, has been working on eating for a while. She herself has been quite public that she is always in recovery from an eating disorder. She's about 4'11" tall. She's a power lifter, but she weighs herself under 100 pounds. She's a boxer, so she boxes at the very lowest weight level. Right? So she's intensely muscular, but skinny. And it turns out that if you're skinny, but you're intensely muscular, you still get a lot of flack from people when you go to the gym. People assume you're weak, but they also get upset when you lift heavy. Right? So many women who go to the gym have been told, "Well, don't lift heavy, you'll get too big." Okay, but that's a healthy kind of big, and yet they're still told to not get too big. Well, to make sense of these kinds of pressures on skinny people and fat people, we need really to look at the work of Sandra Barkey. So Sandra Barkey is a feminist who wrote a couple of really powerful essays. One of them called Skin Deep, Femininity as a Disciplinary Regime, and another one called Foucault, Femininity and Patriarchal Power. And she writes that femininity is a disciplinary regime that penalizes women who do not meet norms of femininity for body size, body shape, and comportment. Now, comportment means how we carry our bodies. So you'll notice that I tend to make lots of big gestures. I talk with my hands a lot. That's not extremely feminine, in fact. The way I sit preferentially is to grab a chair and put my legs over both sides and lean on the back of the chair. That's not a feminine way to sit. It takes up a lot of space, spreads my legs out. It's generally thought of as unladylike and unfeminine, but it's super comfortable. Oh my God, it's so comfortable, right? So what do you like to do with your body that sometimes gets corrected as being not feminine enough? If you are not a woman, if you are gender queer, or a man, what do you like to do with your body that people judge you about for being not manly enough or neither masculine nor feminine enough? So think about that for a second. Okay, so presumably you could come up with something that somebody has once said. So my awareness of this first began when I was about 6. I was at Sunday dinner. And, I was wearing a dress because little girls sometimes wear dresses to church. And this was post-church Sunday dinner with my family. And my Aunt Carolyn said in this really nasty tone of voice, "Get your knees together." I was sitting on this chair with my legs spread because I was comfortable. Right? I was 6 years old. Get your knees together. I was taking up too much space. I was showing too much of my body. Right? So if you ever think about how women sit and how men sit in sort of stereotypical ways, it's very different in terms of how much space they take up. Think of how men cross their legs with their ankle on their knee, which means that their knee is out. Think of how women cross their legs very often with their knees close together, right? Think of how men might sit. This is pretty common, right? Think of how women might sit. This is pretty common, or, with their arms and elbows in. And we don't even think about it because this kind of way of moving our bodies gets taught to us from such a young age that it becomes second nature. And so it feels natural over time, when in fact it's learned and artificial. And the same is true of a lot of ideas we have about size, as well as about how we hold our bodies, and about shape. So if you think about different kinds of fat people, you can imagine a fat, curvy woman. We might call her Rubenesque after the beautiful paintings of attractive, chubby women in Rubens' paintings. And then think of someone who is just plain round, like apple-shaped, right? One of these people might get a plus-size modeling contact, but the other one probably won't. Okay? So it's not just body size, it's also body shape, and it's also body comportment. And so Bartke analyzed all this. And she says that disciplinary practices brought to bear on bodies, men and women and genderqueer people, that these kind of disciplinary measures and practices break down into 3 distinct categories, okay? So I'm gonna put this up here. So the categories that these break down into are 1, those that produce a body of a certain size and configuration. 2, those that bring forth from the body a specific repertoire of gestures, postures, and movements. So gestures, postures, and movements. And then 3, those that are directed toward the display of this body as an ornamented surface. And because these are the 3 things that she thinks are happening, she breaks down what's going on here and says that, in fact, we discipline these through exercise and through diet, and also with the ornamentation, we do makeup and lotions, all kinds of skincare. Men and women do all of these, but for women, they serve a very particular kind of purpose, all right? So I just want to say that in order to achieve a body of a certain size and composition or configuration, one of the things that ends up happening is that fat people live in fear of people realizing that their bodies are as they are, and people who are not yet fat live in fear of becoming fat. Right? So everybody lives in fear of fatness, right? And one of the things to keep in mind here is that this fits in nicely with other analyses of fatness. So Deborah Lupton, who wrote this beautiful, elegant little book like this big called Fat, notes that people who allow themselves to become fat are described as letting themselves go. So they lack internal discipline, right? And relinquishing control and self-discipline over their bodies. Fat bodies, Lupton says, come to be seen as grotesque and a subject of disgust, even contaminating, soiling, and revolting in their lack of containment, their oiliness and propensity to spread over boundaries. So if you think about how you or maybe other people might feel if a fat person is sitting in an airline seat and their fatness spreads over, tends to be very different from how they feel if a very large, muscular man has his body also exceeding the boundaries of the seat. In both cases, the body is exceeding the boundaries of the seat, but it's a different way and it's a different body. So even healthcare providers like nurses, doctors, and nutritionists, who one might think would be informed by biomedicine rather than social stigma, turned out to have highly prejudicial views against fat folks. Fatness is construed as a lapse in control, even by healthcare providers. And one of the things that Bartkey says, going back to Bartkey, is that control this rigid and precise, cannot be maintained without a minute and relentless surveillance. So I just want you to think about this. Who better to engage in this surveillance than those who surround us daily, our family, friends, and social contacts, who have innumerable opportunities to remind us with the tiny knives of subtle comments about how our bodies are lacking, or about how, if we're not careful, they could come to be lacking. Who better also than us, as we internalize these norms and this tendency of always looking at our bodies and then consequently berate ourselves in the mirror or at the breakfast table. So we learn to surveil ourselves because we learn that we are being surveilled, and we learn how we are being surveilled. We learn how we are being watched. In the same way that you start watching your speedometer when you're driving, to see what police might be looking for and to keep your speed under what police might find threatening, we also surveil our eating and our body size and shape and comportment to see how other people were looking at it. And we try to adjust accordingly to avoid penalties. You don't want a speeding ticket, and you don't want those tiny knives of other people's comments or your own internal commentary. Right? So we learn this from the built environment when chairs don't fit us. When we see that they don't fit other people, we might say, well, I never want to be that large. We learn this when we're looking at an airline seat and we see how it's sized. We learn this when we're looking at the chairs in professors' offices. So I deliberately have in my office chairs like this that don't have arms. You can see there's a blanket over one of them. They don't have arms. And the reason that I have gotten ones that don't have arms is so that a student of any size or disability whose body doesn't fit in between chairs with arms can come into my office. So we learn all of this from food messaging and social criticisms of our bodies, from the voices of men hanging out of cars, or from locker room talk about us and others. And we learn it early as we see our mothers and sometimes our fathers get insulted for their bodies. So backhanded compliments, weight loss encouraging, and concern trolling are a way that this happens. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a new TV show you may have heard of. It's, I think it's on Hulu. It's called Shrill. Maybe it's Netflix. I can't remember. And it involves a character named Annie. It's based on Lindy West's very popular memoir about moving through the world as a fat person. I strongly recommend that book if you're a book person. If you're a TV person, maybe Shrill is for you, right? So Annie is actually a relatively happy fat woman, right? She dates, she has sex, she enjoys what she eats, she moves around the world, she walks a lot of places when she goes, right? And one day, at the first episode, upon walking into a coffee shop, she sees a poster on the bulletin board advertising a local physical trainer. The picture of the physical trainer, a woman, is white, slim, wearing a sports bra and exercise tights and doing like a high kick, right? And with the high kick, what she's doing is kicking sad-looking anthropomorphic slices of pizza and donuts. The pizza's like, oh no, as she high kicks them away. And the text reads, get toned with Tanya, burn fat, and get the body you deserve. It has tearaways at the bottom where you could take one and then call Tanya to get toned with Tanya, right? So Annie takes a picture of it, kind of mockingly, intending maybe to post it on social media or something. And it turns out that Tanya is actually in the coffee shop. The woman who has posted this frequents this coffee shop, and she's over there. She comes up, sees Annie taking the picture, encourages her to take one of the tearaways. So Annie's like, oh no, I took a picture, so I'll leave the tabs for somebody else. Right? And as she turns away, Tanya reaches out and grabs her by the wrist and says, "You're lucky. You've got such lovely, tiny wrists. You actually have a really small frame," she says. So Annie grimaces and tries to pull her wrist back, but Tanya won't let go. And Tanya looks Annie in the eye, still holding her wrist, and says, "There's a small person inside of you dying to get out." This is extremely common. Right? So Annie pulls her wrist far back, so Tanya has to let go, smiles and jokes, "Well, I hope that small person's okay in there." Annie turns to walk away, but Tanya follows her a few steps and says cheerily, "I know it can seem impossible. You can do this. You weren't meant to carry around all this extra weight." Okay? So Annie turns to walk away, but again, Tanya, who's still maintaining total control of the situation, follows her a few steps and says, "I know it can seem impossible. You can do this. You weren't meant," right? So Annie's eyes get large and her face indignant at this point, and she responds in a sarcastic tone of voice with a smile. "Wow, very cool." Tanya persists, "I know I can help you." Annie turns away again and says thank you dismissively, and Tanya keeps at it, again controlling the conversation. "No," she says, "thank yourself for the amazing way you're going to feel after you give yourself permission to be well. You could be so pretty," she whispers. And then Tanya controls when she leaves the encounter. Right? So all of this is a kind of series of backhanded compliments, right? You could be so pretty. There's a skinny person dying to get out, right? And then there's also kind of concern trolling, which is when somebody acts like they're concerned for someone's welfare and they dig at somebody's fatness or unhealthy behaviors or something like that, but they aren't really concerned for their welfare or they wouldn't be so mean, right? So there are all these kinds of things going on. And when I watched this, I thought, I can't watch this show anymore. I'm giving you an example from the first episode because I couldn't make it to the second episode. Why? Because this was exactly like what actually happens. And every fat person I have talked to says, yes, this is exactly like what actually happens. It can be freeing to recognize yourself in a TV show, but it can also be terrible. All right. So I'm going to give you another thing to think about. And so the reading that you were given to watch along with this lecture was Lisa Schwartzman's article on desire. And she looks at both eating desires and sex desires, right? So through the kinds of comments that Annie gets in Shrill, through the kinds of comments we all make to each other or to ourselves, through the kinds of comments we grow up with in the air we breathe, right? About how our bodies should be shaped, sized, and comported, right? Through all of this, our desires are constrained and bottled up. And this is especially true, Schwartzman says, for women. And it is especially true of both eating desires, so desires for food, and desires for sex, right? If you're curious someday, Google women eating salads, and you will see all these pictures of women gloriously, deliciously eating salads, right? So this kind of thing indicates that there is an emphasis on women's eating, being happy to eat salads, right? Sometimes I've done Google searches of women in cake or women eating cake, and they're often depicted as gluttonous, like an enormous size piece of cake, or a person with an unhappy face as though they're being driven to eat the cake, right? But what Schwartzman wants us to pay attention to is how norms of femininity shrink women's desires, shrink bodies, or get us to feel like we ought to be smaller, right? And then also get us to feel like we ought to be guided by the desires of others with respect to what to eat, how much to eat, but also with whom to have sex, when to have sex, how much to have sex, whether to initiate sex or simply be receptive to it, and whether to ask for it, for instance, like to flat out ask somebody if they want to have sex as a woman is much, much harder than it is as a man. Right? Now, some people listening to this might think, well, in the Me Too movement, it's much more fraught for men to ask women for sex. Yeah, more so than it used to be. So just give some thought as to whether it ought to be more fraught, more difficult, require more thought and forethought to ask women for sex than it used to be. And that's, of course, all assuming a heteronormative view about who your partner is. Studies of lesbians indicate that lesbians also have trouble asking their same-sex partners for sex or initiating sex, whereas gay men find it a little bit easier, right? Once they're sure that the person they're talking to is in fact interested in a same-sex sexual relationship, men find it easier to ask other men than women find it easier to ask other women. Women find it harder to ask men when they're straight or bisexual, and men find it easier to ask women and to ask men if they're straight or bisexual or gay. So, this is just something to think about. Have you ever restricted your desires or acting on your desires in order to be a good girl or a better woman if you identify as a woman? If you're gender non-binary, have you ever felt subject to these kinds of pressures? If you identify as a man, have you felt that you've got to be careful about who you ask for sex, but that's acceptable for you to want sex and to initiate sex? Do you even maybe feel pressured to want sex? Well, that's something that sociologist Michael Kimmel's book, Guyland, talks about. So Michael Kimmel interviewed hundreds of young men, college age, mostly white. And what he found was that they routinely talk about sex. They, in fact, actually use it as reputational coin. So people who have had sex will have higher standing reputationally with other men who have had sex with women who will have higher standing with other men. That it's about desire, but it's also about a kind of entitlement, like that if men pursue women, they should be able to get it. Now, since sleeping with women becomes reputational coin, he found that men who are trying to pull or hook up in order to increase their reputations see women's refusal as an obstacle to their reputational success with other men. So they see women not wanting to have sex with them as something that's getting in the way of their social achievements. Now, that's not true for all men. He also interviewed men who felt that these pressures were ruining their lives, but they still felt the pressure. Okay. This is all about needing to appear to be a player, even if the person actually wants monogamy and a loving relationship. So men, like women, also suffer from bodily disciplinarity. They're supposed to have low body fat, and they're supposed to be intensely muscular. In fact, you may have seen pictures in the media of an inguinal fold. This is sort of the classic male model thing where the pants are riding low and there's like a little bit of hip, like a little muscle/tendon thing that's showing. There are incredibly skinny people for whom that doesn't show. It's largely a genetic lottery combined with extremely low body fat and high muscularity. It's very difficult to get that look, but that look is what men are allegedly supposed to aspire to. And yet it's really almost impossible for most men to get to. Possibly for this reason, we're seeing that eating disorders amongst women are not really falling, but eating disorders amongst boys and men are rising. So we're getting to parity, we're getting to equality in the worst possible way when it comes to eating disorders. But let's get back to women versus men and Schwartzman's article, right? So one thing to keep thinking about is how it is that there is a key important difference between the pressures that men face with respect to their bodies and the pressures that women face. So the norms of masculinity make men bigger, more powerful, more aggressive, more likely to take what they want, to take charge, to get social status. Right? The norms of femininity make women weaker, smaller. You're not supposed to interrupt. If you're too bossy, people will call you bossy, which is something that men are rarely called. If you're really bossy, they'll call you a bitch. So these kinds of norms of how to act, how to behave, how to be sized, how to eat, how to exercise, whether or not to get too big if you're a woman and you're exercising or not, with respect to muscularity, right? These work differently for men and women. So both men and women suffer from the disciplinarity of these norms, in Barkey's terms. But I would argue that men who conform, who are able to conform, benefit, whereas women who are able to conform suffer and they lose social status. They become literally smaller, literally less intimidating. All right, so Barkey calls the body that's produced by these disciplinary mechanisms of diet and exercise a docile body, right? So it's a body that cooperates with the norms, that actually potentially harms itself to conform to the norms, right? Those who cannot comply or choose not to comply get punished. Constant insults, furniture not designed for them, people not thinking about how to make sure they can be incorporated into classroom designs and desk choices when the university buys thousands of new desks. Are they big enough for fat people? Are there enough for there to be more than one disabled person in the room at a time? In SIUE, if you've been in an on-campus class, you know there's only one disabled desk where the chair is not attached to the table in the classrooms that have the fixed chair and table arrangement for the other desks. Right? So one of the things to think about here, in addition to disciplinarity, to how these norms affect men and women differently, is to what happens to people who are genderqueer or gender non-binary. They also feel these pressures, but people aren't sure which set of pressures to use. It can be very confusing in our society for most people to encounter a genderqueer or gender non-binary person, because the pressure to know what gender somebody is so that you know what set of expectations to use for them is very intense. So they get punished as intensely as any fat person who deviates from the norms. And it's not just fat people who get punished for deviating from norms of eating. It's anyone who might become fat, all right? One thing to think about as we're leaving this, and my last thing for you to think about, is that when genderqueer, gender non-binary people and fat people, or anybody who is eating in public, are happy, they threaten the system. So fat, happy people threaten the system. Happy gender non-binary, gender queer folks, they threaten the system, right? And the system that disciplines women who are not small, women who take up space, requires that fat people be sad and ashamed. So you might have seen news pieces on obesity. And if you think about how fat people were depicted, it was often like from behind if they showed a whole body shot, or it was what media specialists like Professor Spino, right? What media specialists call headless fatties, okay? So the headless fatty is where you have a still shot from the neck down, or moving pictures from the neck down only, like shots of people's butts and legs walking down the street, right? Fat people's butts and legs. So the headless fatty is based on the assumption that fat people should be ashamed. And that if they were on the local news talking about them as being fat, they would be shamed and maybe even ought to be ashamed, right? So it is, again, assumed that fat folks, especially fat women, will be ashamed. And that is why the headless fatty pictures exist, right? Our media works hard to make us ashamed of having non-normative bodies, right? How else are we who are fat or may become fat, so all of us, supposed to feel about a rapid weight loss TV show, a competition called The Biggest Loser? This clearly incorporates shame, right? In fact, it's kind of a little bit of a jujitsu move, like a twist, right? A flip. You are a loser if you don't lose. And that's the entire point of the title, that people are losers if they don't lose. So when women, whether slim or fat, men, whether slim or fat, when gender queer folks insist on being happy and being seen to be happy when they're violating these disciplinary norms, that disrupts everything. So next time you're watching TV, think, how are the fat people depicted? Are they depicted as miserable or ashamed or always trying to lose weight unsuccessfully? Or do they get to go about their lives and be people who just happen to be fat? Right? So when fat people are unashamed and are happy, it's a blow to the system. It says that all persons have human dignity, desires that are okay, pleasures worth seeking out. And so the last thing I'll say to you is this: eat happy, live well, get pleasure unashamedly, use your body to do things that give you pleasure, to move through the world actively. Be good to others. Don't hold those tiny knives of disciplinarity. Demand dignity and respect in the body that you have now, not some body you might have later. Thanks for your time.